And it's currently setting up. Redirecting to YouTube.
You all can't see the chat window on my screen, right?
Yep. Joanne, you have a run signal that you need to get rid of at the bottom of your screen.
No, I see that. I'm asking.
Good morning.
No.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 3rd Legislative District Town Hall. Today, my name is David Green. I'm chair of the 3rd Legislative District. We also have as a co-moderator, Nicole Bishop, the chair of the Spokane County Democrats Organization. And we're really thrilled to have us joined by State Senator Andy Billig, State Representative Marcus Riccelli, and State Representative Tim Ormsby. If you've got questions for this morning's town hall, please email them to townhall@3rdld.org, all lowercase, townhall@3rdld.org. And we already have about 10 or 15 questions that have come in so far. And we'll be, after we have some brief opening statements from the 3 legislators, we will go from there. Andy, if you would be so kind, I'm going to ask you to start off with just a quick question. This is a long session from my understanding. Would you be able to tell the folks on the YouTube this morning as to what does a long session mean for the legislature, and what does it mean to you as the state Senate Majority Leader?
Very well. Thank you, David, for hosting, and Nicole and Joanne, and thanks everybody for joining us. Good morning and Happy New Year. So in terms of the long session and short session, the state legislature operates on a 2-year cycle. So the first year, which is the year after the even year elections, is the long session. So that this is indeed a long session, which is prescribed by the Constitution to be 105 days, which takes us to the end of April, and we'll start on January 11th. And the reason for the long session is because this is the year that we do the full 2-year biennial budget. And then the short session, which will be next year, which is prescribed to be 60 days, is meant to do tweaks to the budget as well as other policies that may be needed. When the state was first started, there were actually only sessions every other year. So there was no long session and short session. There was the session year and the non-session year. But as our state got larger and policies more complicated, there was the need to add the second session. In terms of what it means for us, the long session obviously means more time focused on the budget. And luckily, Representative Ormsby represents us also well as the House budget chair. But it's also a longer time for policies. So more serious policies, I think, tend to get considered in the long session because there's just so much time. This year will be a little different just because it's going to be so different. We'll talk about this a little later in terms of it being partially remote. So usually the long session also means a lot more time away from home and away from our families and friends and communities. And that'll be a little different this year.
Super, Andy. And why don't we go ahead and have each of the 3 of you talk a little bit about your personal priorities for the session. And I think we were thinking about 3 to 4 minutes a piece for that. And who'd like to go first? Andy, would you like to go first, or do you want to pick on Marcus or Tim since they're in the junior chamber?
I'll defer to one of them since I just went.
It's actually the lower chamber, David.
Okay.
Junior and senior are not designations we use.
Go ahead, Tim, as the senior member.
Now there you go, Andy. That's really proper use of the vernacular. So coming into this session, we have all just been through hell, right? And we're still kind of going through it. I think it was Winston Churchill that said, when you're going through hell, the only thing you can do is just keep going. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to, based on things that we've been able to do to cobble together some functionality, we're going to continue down that road. For the House Democratic Caucus, we have 4 focuses. Marcus can explain this in some greater detail. Issues surrounding racial equity are going to be huge. for us this year, as well as COVID recovery. And that's kind of a two-sided bit of business, both on the public health side, but also economic recovery and also climate related issues as our four big priority areas. This budget year, as Andy explained, is the long session where we do the biennial budget. It's going to be broken up into, as I anticipate, three categories. We always do a supplemental budget, meaning that we make adjustments for the last 6 months of the 2-year period. And then we budget for the upcoming 2 years. That is standard procedure in a long session like this. Add to those two things that we always do an early recovery action, which we're in the midst of working on to try and create investments from the state and with the new federal dollars that just passed within the last week to set ourselves up for a trajectory of success, not only in those four areas, but in all areas. As far as my personal, outside of the $55+ billion 2-year budget, I'm going to be working on housing issues to try and generate more resources for housing. We have a thing called a document recording fee. I ran the first bill on document recording fees back in 2005, so it feels like I'm coming full circle to add another $100 to document recording fees. And that is when you buy a house, when you refinance a house, when you do something mortgage and debt related and file the paperwork for it. There is an assessment currently of, I believe, right around $60 that is dispersed in a very Byzantine kind of way, but we'd be adding $100 to that. So a substantial increase in the document recording fee to deal with the myriad housing issues with eviction on top of mind for folks, as well as mortgage foreclosure and other housing affordability and stability issues. That is a huge thing. And also trying to hold accountable folks that receive tax exemptions from the state in the food processing business, because we know this is a largely immigrant and first generation workforce being taken advantage of in many situations by the employers. And if they're going to get a tax exemption from the state, then there's minimum behavior that we expect for them in just from a human standpoint in treating the workforce. Those will be two large focuses of mine and outside of everything that's related to the general operating budget. And thank you for having us, and thanks for joining us on a Saturday morning. And we've been through hell in 2020, and let's take this opportunity to set ourselves up for a more successful 2021.
Thank you so much, Tim. Marcus, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much, David. And thanks to the folks who put this together. Thanks, obviously, to my seatmates, Andy and Tim. We make a great team. Yeah, very challenging year and very challenging session ahead, but we're ready to roll up our sleeves and go to work. I think Tim did some nice outlines on kind of the broader bucket priorities, particularly from my standpoint. One of the best things we can do is help people get back to work. And so I work covering our capital budget and transportation. I'm excited for a robust capital budget that can put money into public works, into community projects, and just get people working. We will have a transportation budget, but we're also looking at a potential for a transportation revenue package. And that also could have some advantage of putting people to work and making sure that we're getting our goods to market, et cetera. So I'm excited to be working on that. I've been tapped by our House Transportation Chair, be part of that revenue cabinet to look at that discussion. And I think we'll have some exciting ideas to put forward. One that doesn't seem so exciting is just protecting what we have, and that's preservation and maintenance of our existing infrastructure, and then finishing what we started, including major projects in our area. My big priorities broadly, I continue to work on health and healthcare. Oral health is a passion of mine, but certainly making sure that we're not reducing access in any way to oral health or to our folks who are on Medicaid, and particularly those who are just above the line of Medicaid, who are maybe struggling to get healthcare on the exchange. We need to make sure there's affordable, accessible, quality healthcare for all. I'm really interested into food security, to making sure that people have enough to eat. We shouldn't be in a situation where we're not, where people are going hungry, that people, like Tim said, and what he's working on, don't have roofs over their heads. We know that people won't thrive without the basics. And then one interesting topic that I think has really emerged, it started with education. I'm interested in it from an education standpoint, but a healthcare and a job creation standpoint, is digital equity. We need to make sure people have access to the technology and broadband so that they can be safe in COVID times, so we can reduce barriers to access and we can make sure that people are successful. And some particular bills that I will be working on, you might have heard, we had some dust ups here around how our health board and our health officer was fired. I'm looking to address that from a local standpoint and a statewide standpoint to make sure we have more balance on our health boards, that we have more healthcare professionals, that we have more folks who are consumers of public health. So we have equity represented and we have balance. I don't think any of us think that there should be 9 out of 12 members on a health board that should be elected officials with not necessarily the public health background or experience. So we need to bring balance there. I think what I want to do is stop there and just say, and just reiterate what Tim said, that we're looking from a health equity standpoint and an equity in general standpoint, particularly in budgeting and equity lens, to make sure that we're making sure that everybody can thrive in our community and across our state. So I'll leave it there and look forward to Andy's remarks and just answering your questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Andy, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you again. Great to be able to have this opportunity to chat with everyone, and eager to get to your questions. So I'll be brief in my overall comments. I appreciate what Tim and Marcus had to say. And I think from the Senate perspective, we're going to be focused on many of the same things. It's about COVID recovery, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective. And, you know, this pandemic has exposed and exacerbated some cracks that already existed, but they got bigger because of the pandemic, and they got a spotlight on them. And things from healthcare inequities to childcare and education, broadband, racial justice. I mean, there were so many housing, environmental issues. There's so many areas that got worse and that we got a spotlight on. The upside is it gives us a little bit of momentum because we've got a spotlight. And I think we have a little clearer picture. I hear people talking about investments in foundational public health, in fighting health disparities, and investing in childcare more than I ever have before. And so, looking for some silver linings, I feel like we have some momentum to make progress in those areas. You know, I think the other thing that I wanted to touch on was how the session's going to look, because I think that's a question for many people, especially the type of people that tune in for a town hall meeting or people that engage with the legislature. You can see behind me the Senate hard at work. This is not a live photo. This is my virtual background. The Senate is not going to look like that this year. We are going to have a mostly remote session. So all of the committee meetings will be remote. All of our caucus meetings and constituent meetings are going to be remote. And then the session is going to be mostly remote. We'll have a few members on the floor to help make sure everything runs smoothly. And most of the rest of the members will be logging in remotely. The House is going to be very similar and exactly similar in committees, which is a real step forward. We've always been a little different in our committee operations. And I was really glad that House and Senate administration were able to work together. So for constituents, it's easy. It's not a different procedure to participate. And that's one of the, again, looking for a silver lining, because the committees are going to be remote and all the testimony is going to be remote. It actually is going to be easier access for our constituents. Instead of having to drive 10 hours round trip over a snowy mountain pass to testify for 2 minutes on a bill, you can now do that from your own kitchen table. And not just for people from Eastern Washington, but even people that live close to Olympia, but that have transportation issues or disabilities or childcare challenges. Now they can also testify remotely on an even playing field with everybody else. That is going to be extremely challenging. We think our capacity to pass legislation is going to be down significantly. We're guessing 50%, but we really don't know. And then one of the challenges is that we do have to be there physically present the first day to set up the procedures for remote voting. That has to be done with a quorum in person. And so the first day will be challenging. And, our goal on remote and hybrid session is to, one, keep everybody safe, the staff, the legislators, and the public. We want to make sure that we keep transparency or increase transparency, which is actually, I think, what's going to happen. We're going to have increased transparency and participation. And then the last thing is we want to make sure it's effective. We've still got to pass the biennial budget. We've got to pass some important priority policy bills to keep building opportunity and prosperity for the people of Washington State. So, it's a little bit of an unknown. A lot of work has gone into preparing for this mostly virtual session. And, I'll be eager for your input as we go along on how things are going. And if you feel like you're getting access and if there's any things we can do, because we'll be learning as we go. So let's get on to questions. And you can ask questions for an individual legislator or, sort of generally, and we'll take turns answering, and maybe in some cases, multiple people will answer. But thanks so much for this opportunity.
Super. And Joanne, perhaps you can post temporarily, just for a minute or so, the email address that folks can use to send in questions. We've gotten about 15 in so far. The first came in on Tuesday. Questions can be emailed to townhall@thirdld.org, townhall@thirdld.org. And the very first questions that did come in on Tuesday, one came in from Dawn and another one from Jim Sharman, related to COVID vaccinations and what is the process that Washington State will be using to have vaccinations inside our state. And I don't know whether the legislature has anything to do with that, but I'm hopeful that the governor has kept the legislature informed as to what the process is. So if one of you could just talk about that process, I know there's a lot of folks out there that have questions on that.
Marcus, do you want to take that as our
Sure.
person?
Yeah, so one of the things we can do is follow up to and make sure that the Washington State COVID-19 vaccine allocation guidance document and website is shared. But right now we're in phase 1A. The vaccinations will be rolled out in a phase approach, and the goal is to reduce severe morbidity and mortality and negative societal impact due to the transmission of the COVID-19 virus. And so it talks about the guiding ethical principles, procedural principles, and the criteria. And we can share that, but it's not like those things are very succinct. For example, the ethical principles are the maximum benefit, equal concern, and mitigation of health inequities. And the procedural principles are fairness, transparency, and that it's evidence-based. And right now we're in phase 1A, which the tier 1 is high-risk workers in healthcare settings, high-risk first responders, and residents and staff of nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and community-based congregate living settings where most individuals over 65 years of age are receiving care, supervision, or assistance. That's the phase we're in. It'll go down. And it doesn't go like phase 1 to phase 2. There's a phase 1A, phase 1B, phase 1C, and we'll get that information out there. But it has been made very public, so residents and citizens can understand how that is being rolled out.
Thank you, Marcus. Nicole, would you like to ask the question that Joel had submitted? And I think this one probably should be directed at Tim, because it has to do with spending money, and Tim is chair of the House Appropriations Committee.
Sounds great. Yes. And thank you all for being here today, especially on a Saturday morning. Happy New Year. So this question comes from Joel, and it reads, Washington has made great progress on its Alzheimer's and dementia state plan, in large part because of the hard work of the staff and volunteers that work with the Dementia Action Collaborative, or the DAC. Do you support the $1 million that the governor put on his budget to continue the work of the DAC? And then the second part to that question is, do you support funding for universal rapid COVID testing for staff and visitors at long-term care facilities?
Tim, you're muted. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if that didn't happen. Thank you for getting that out of the way.
Someone
Yeah.
did
Like
patent
Zoom
that
bingo.
phrase. Yes, thanks, Nicole, and thank you, Joel. So I make no promises about what the legislature will end up doing. I would just observe that the three of us, Andy as Senate Majority Leader, Marcus as Majority Whip in key leadership positions, myself on the budget team, we get those jobs because we're trusted by our colleagues to be fair and equitable in performing our obligations. As far as the budget goes, I think it is a very reasonable ask, Joel, for $1 million increase that the Dementia Action Collaborative have come up with. I would say that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And we have really taken on the dementia and dementia-related diseases from a standpoint of trying to ramp up to address that. As far as what the legislature plans on doing, we will certainly be, we're just beginning a process of doing the early action thing, as I explained at the outset. That is almost our sole focus at this time. When it comes to the budgeting process, that will begin a little bit later this year when we'll be putting together the consideration for $1 million additional dollars into the Dementia Action Collaborative has come up with. We don't know what that's going to look like. And it is not my intention to be vague other than just to manage the expectations that the word for this coming session is uncertain, very much like the past 10 months have been uncertain in many respects. And we're going to distribute the resources that we have, much like Marcus explained the distribution of the vaccine in a fair and equitable fashion, and identifying primary needs. And we're going to focus on, as Marcus likes to say, on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs stuff, food and shelter, things that, and not that any of the other things we're going to be considering are not important. We have to get our houses on fire, and we have to get it put out. That'll be priority one.
Thank you, Tim. Speaking of shelter, Cheryl had submitted a question on Terry's behalf that relates to the eviction moratorium, the temporary eviction moratorium that the governor's put in, and the fact, and they state in the question that, they're concerned that the Spokane County Commissioners did not allocate anything out of their $90-some million worth of CARES Act funding for rental assistance, and Spokane and Spokane Valley did spend some money on rental assistance, but it's all gone. Is the state in a position where it might consider some type of just cause eviction law that would prohibit no cause notices to terminate and no cause term lease non-renewal notices during the current session?
I can talk about the eviction moratorium, but maybe Marcus, I think you've been working on the no cause. You want to start with that, or you want me to go? Okay. Well, I'll just say on the eviction moratorium, regardless of what's happening in terms of county or city spending, the state has invested quite a bit of the state CARES money into rental assistance. And I think we haven't decided yet how we're going to spend the new federal money, but there is some federal money directly related to rental assistance. And I think, as we eventually ease off the eviction moratorium, we are going to need a large sum of money to make sure that we don't create a homelessness crisis at that time. And so I think we will be using those federal funds, directing those through the state, sort of in conjunction with the eviction moratorium easing up. I don't see it as a situation where it just ends one day, because I just don't think that would be responsible for tenants or for landlords. And then in terms of sort of a longer term policy change on just cause of eviction, I know that will be a topic of discussion. Whether it has the votes to pass or not, I'm not sure. And it's an area Marcus has worked on quite a bit. So I don't know, Marcus, if you have anything to add.
No, I'm actually going to kick it to Tim because he's working on some housing stuff and taking the lead. But I do want to say, I hope at some point maybe we can address, I don't think it's fair to let slide our county commissioners and their responsibility for allocating CARES dollars. And so one of the things I think Andy and Tim and I want to make clear is that after almost 5 years, there's a new process where there'll be 5 county commissioners and not 3. They'll be voted by district. There's a redistricting process coming up, and we'd like to share a little bit because I think it's important. These are the types of decisions from our health boards to CARES dollars to something as simple as we had to pass a law to add a tribal representative to our Spokane Regional Transportation Council, and that doesn't seem to be being adhered to, that we get a little bit further in this. But on top of housing, Tim is the original housing guru. I've been involved off and on the capital budget. He has a very exciting proposal he's working on, and I think I'd like to turn it to him for a second.
Well, thanks, Marcus. This is a little bit of a legislative history example. We ran what was called a lawful source of income. Then they changed the name to source of income discrimination, which was a bill I probably ran 10 or 12 years ago. And God bless Marcus, he actually sponsored that bill and actually passed it. So speaks very much to his tenacity and effectiveness in the legislative arena. And the timing was really good. So for the state has so far distributed, and I wish I had a real concrete number, somewhere in the vicinity of about $150 million in rental assistance out of the state's portion of our COVID money from the federal government, going back to the CARES Act, going back to the money that the Congress passed in March. In this most recent federal package, there is $500 million available for rental assistance. We have to be very smart about investing that timing wise. And we have to wait for some guidance from the federal government. Is that available for back rent? Is that just going forward? We have to know what the rules of engagement are and how much are we limited by the federal restrictions in the legislation, and how much state money would we need to kick in order to deal with the entirety of the problem of evictions and the just cause issue. I think, and the simple answer to the question is the environment right? Yes, it is right. And as Andy explained in his comments, it is really, this crisis has really exposed a lot of the previous flaws that we kind of papered over a little bit. I heard an author explaining a book she had recently written. This is like we sprayed luminol on a crime scene, and we are seeing all of the policy DNA flaws that we've been exposed to. And the time is right on that, on housing and many other issues as well.
Great. Thanks so much for that. And I love that luminol analogy. I think it's super apt. Our next question here is from Lorna, and she does have research that she included that we're happy to forward over to all of you. But she asks if you will write legislation mandating Washington schools to increase recess and physical breaks for K-12 students during the school day at 10 to 15 minutes of physical activity outside or in the classroom for every hour of academic learning during the school day.
I'd be happy to jump in if that's okay.
That's all you, Marcus.
Okay,
Yeah.
So, we actually have laws on the books right now that our students should be getting certain numbers of minutes a week. Obviously, we're in different times right now, but let's go back to a world where hopefully we're in person again at some point, and really not just making sure that we get the 100 minutes a week that these students K through 8 are supposed to be getting mandated by law, but they're supervised by people who are trained to do that. And it's not like when I went to school, it's not just about throwing a basketball around or a football or whatever. It's about students getting their heart rate up so they can move to learn. And I really like the idea of these intermittent breaks, and people are are engaged in, and we know that attention spans are a certain amount of time and that kids need to move to learn. And we also face an obesity and diabetes epidemic. So while I can't speak to writing a specific law, I've been working with Shape Washington. We're actually trying to really analyze the data that came back from a bill that I worked on to see exactly how many of these students were getting that 100 minutes of time, and not to punish schools that weren't doing it, but to figure out how we can work with them to get them up to that level. But it's clearly not enough. I really like the idea too about doing that around 10 and 15-minute intervals to break up the learning so that kids can move to learn for two reasons. One, I think there'll be less disruptions in the classroom. I think they'll be happier and they'll be more focused. I also think we just got to get them moved to learn. This is unfortunately kids today are the first generation slated to not outlive their parents because of obesity and diabetes.
One thing I wanted to add is I totally support, the premise of the question and everything that Representative Riccelli said. The other thing that's changed over, compared to, 30 years ago or 40 years ago is we've engineered the easy ways for active transportation out of our society. So, the number of kids that can walk and bike to work or to school have gone down significantly. And to the extent that we can, and we've all three of us have been active in supporting Safe Routes to Schools funding, but it's more than that. I mean, those are mitigation. Those are things that are like trying to fix the design flaws that we've put into our system. So I think from a city, county, state perspective, we need to be focused as we do development, that we make sure that sidewalks and protected bike lanes are just givens and not seen as some kind of an added amenity, because it's not only a transportation priority, but it's also a health and fitness priority for kids and really people of all ages.
Thank you. We've got a quick question from Rosemary from Northern Spokane County up in the 7th Legislative District. She's a retired nurse, and she is wondering whether any of the retired medical professionals have been reached out to, or can they participate in the COVID-19 vaccination process? And if you're not sure about that, is there some way that we could get information from the appropriate folks and pass that information back to her and publicize it locally? Because we do have a fair number of retired medical professionals in the greater Spokane area.
I don't know the answer to that. I know we're really working to engage students, healthcare students in the process and provide them to do, but I'd be happy to follow up and make sure that we get that information. I know that in certain areas that our retired nurses, particularly, were called into service in emergency rooms and other areas where they're just desperate for personnel, but I don't know the answer on the COVID-19. I think it's a fantastic question. Let me see if I can follow up.
Okay. Nicole, would you go ahead and like to take care of Kathleen's question?
Absolutely. So Kathleen asks, she wants to inquire how you will be supporting renewable energy for our local waste resources in this coming year.
That is one of the areas, Andy, you're the closest one of us to utilizing. If I could just say to start with, we have the very high honor and privilege of having as the director of the Department of Commerce, former Senate Majority Leader Lisa Brown, who is the point of the spear on a lot of this kind of monetizing and figuring out the economic side of alternative resources. Andy, you've been working on this for many years.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's a number of things to think about there. I mean, certainly when you talk about there was a mention of waste, so I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of just renewable resources, the solar incentive program we have needs to be renewed and extended. So that is one thing that will come up, and hopefully we will be able to get done this year. And I think you will see quite a bit of environmental legislation coming forward with momentum and the possibility that it'll pass, that it'll be going towards climate action as well as other sustainability priorities. But one thing specific about waste, and I love this question because it's something I've been working on for a long time. It's sort of, we all specialize in just a few different areas, even though we have to work on, you can't be an expert on all 10,000 issues that we work on. And so we really do specialize. And when I was a freshman in the House 10 years ago, the chair of the House Energy Committee, Senator McCoy, handed me a file and said, "Billig, this is your bill to run." And I opened it up, and it was a bill about sustainable aviation biofuels. So we passed that bill, which did a number of things, including creating the Sustainable Aviation Biofuels Work Group for Washington State. And I've been the chair of that work group ever since. And the goal of that group is to connect all the different players, because it's a relatively young industry and there's a lot of potential for Washington State. We haven't gotten one of our goals done, which is to get an aviation biofuels production plant in Washington State. But we are getting closer, and there is the latest effort is there's a company that's looking to site an aviation biofuels production facility in Washington State, and they would site it at a place near a solid waste facility, because their feedstock would be municipal solid waste. And this would just be such an amazing win for our state, because it would be job creation. It would be a way to deal with waste in a productive way, in a renewable way, and it would be a way for us to provide aviation biofuels that are renewable. So we're still a few years away from seeing that in action, but there is progress, and hopefully we'll make, you asked about this year. So it won't go into production this year, but hopefully we'll make progress this year.
And we have a question from Aaron here in the 3rd Legislative District. Aaron's active in Hull, Washington, which has been proposing universal healthcare bills. And she would like to know whether each one of you will be supporting a universal healthcare bill in this current session.
Yes. I don't know, that does not speak to the prospects of its inevitability, but one of the things we can do as members is advance these concepts for the purposes of discussion, to apply pressure, to get the issue moving further along. There are so many economic and outside factors, but the Health Security Trust legislation has been around for more than 10 years. And, it's something I regularly sign on to as not a healthcare expert, but as someone that is interested in using the position to apply pressure and advance the cause for universal healthcare and the fact that it's a right.
I support it as well. I think, and like Tim, have signed on and been helpful as we try to fund things like the work group, et cetera, to move universal healthcare forward. I think what's important, though, is always to keep multiple tracks going so that we're continuing to advance affordable, quality, accessible healthcare for all. One of the biggest things that I think you'll hear about, and it's tied to the governor request language that I'll be prime sponsoring, and Senator Robinson in the Senate will be sponsoring to restructure our health boards, is funding of foundational public health. Also, in addition to that, looking at a tax on lives covered, and we can talk a little bit more of that if people want to dive in. But part of that I'm very interested in making sure that we've asked the exchange to look at subsidies for people paying their premiums on the exchange. At one point in the healthcare committee, my jaw dropped because it was like 77,000 people on the exchange had a deductible of, I believe, over $7,500, and that's not affordable. So ways that we can help support people on the exchange, particularly right above the Medicaid. I think Washington State's done an amazing job on expanding Medicaid, but we have folks that are right above that line that are really struggling, and particularly now in a pandemic, we need to make sure that people have access. So my answer is yes, but I also think there's a lot of strategy we can do as we work to move affordable healthcare forward for all Washingtonians.
Yeah, and I'll say, one of the things we've seen in this pandemic, and I think we probably knew it beforehand, but is that it doesn't make sense for our healthcare to be connected to a job, because when you have a major event like a pandemic, people not only lose their job, but they lose their healthcare at the same time. And so it was unfortunate, but good example of why this is a bad idea. And it was a artificial construct that came out of kind of the post World War II era that healthcare was connected to jobs. There's no your electrical service is not connected to your job. It doesn't have to be, and for some people it's not. So, and I think there should be universal access to affordable, high quality care. And kind of as was said earlier, I think that there are a lot of models for that. And I'm for the model we can get done that gives universal access to high quality, affordable care. And if that's single payer, that's fine. If it's a universal system that some other countries have done, where it's just guaranteed and state subsidized for everybody, and that's what we can get done, then I'm for that as well. But nobody should not have insurance, and nobody should have insurance with a $7,500 deductible, because that's just like not having insurance at all.
I just want to add to, like Andy said, we also don't want to provide a disincentive as people are looking to get back to work. And if they bump above that level that has Medicaid, and all of a sudden there's a cliff for them, that's not what we want to be doing too. We want continuity of coverage. We don't want churn between whether you have a job and potentially in this environment lose it, or you're below that threshold and then get above it because you've been given a new responsibility, et cetera. So I think we have to look at too these arbitrary lines that really leave people hanging. And it's not just healthcare; it's in childcare and a whole bunch of other areas.
Thank you so much. The next question I have is from Larry, and he wants to know if the clean fuel standards will pass this year.
It will pass in the House, and I'm not. That's no pressure on my good friend Andy. I'm just. It has been. It has been a focus, and we've talked a little bit here about our division of labor. Marcus does our healthcare stuff. Andy does all areas of our education policy as one of his things. I do like obscure budget related things, but we have a real champion in the House, Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, who is a good friend of all of ours, that has been spearheading this effort in the past. He will continue to do so. It is a priority of the governor. I see that as having legs.
Yeah, and in terms of this, I definitely support. I've been public in my support of passing the clean fuel standard. I think what we're working on, there seems to be some momentum building for a package of climate legislation, including a clean fuel standard, coupled with a transportation infrastructure package, and so that we pass all of that together. And it makes sense because they're connected. So that's what we're working towards. I think that there's support for that in the Senate. It's about getting the details and making sure there's support once we get all the details in there. I think the governor is also supportive of that, and there's good bipartisan or bicameral work, and also working with some of our Republican colleagues to see if we can get support for that as well.
Thank you, Senator. Joanne, would you be able to toss up the slide with the town hall at 3rd LD email address? We're about halfway through this morning's sessions, and we do have some questions still remaining in the queue, but if you'd like to submit a question right now, that would be wonderful. We only have 4 or 5 in queue, and we'll likely be getting through those relatively quickly. So send your questions in via email to townhall@thirdld.org. And I'm going to rise to a moment of personal privilege and ask a question, which is, I've been following the work that Representative Drew Hansen has been doing. Representative Hansen's from the West Side, and I believe he's putting together a piece of legislation that talks about something along the lines of regulating broadband as a utility. And I wonder if you're familiar with where that is and what's the likelihood of its passage during this particular session.
I'm following it. I think we have another leader in the House as well, Representative Mia Gregerson, who's been pulling broad stakeholder groups together, looking at, and then there's a number in the Senate, I know as well, that are looking at broadband issues. One of the things that I think is interesting is just the actual ability of potentially a retail authority for public utilities. A lot of times we actually have an entity right here in the 3rd district, NoaNet, that works with public utilities to build kind of the last mile, and then the big companies of the world are able to use that. And it's not always conduit. Sometimes it's relay via wireless. But what I think is important there is that some of our big players say we'll go anywhere, but the truth is they won't. They won't. It's just too expensive for them. And so what do we look at, particularly in a COVID pandemic? But I think from an education and healthcare standpoint, particularly is it a public good? And then how do we get that last mile? It's said to get to 97% of all Washingtonians to have reliable access to the internet, be about a $3 billion effort. What is interesting from what Drew is working on is, do we give them the ability to retail so that they can make some money on this and incentivize them to go to some of these areas that are more difficult? I personally think it's worthwhile and I would be supportive. I think it's a huge fight, and I think Andy and Tim can maybe give some perspective. It's a huge fight. Bottom line, it'll be a huge fight to do that. But do I think internet is a public good at this point, the same way a phone line is? Yeah. A utility. Yeah. There are some folks working really closely on internet work that don't actually agree with that language. They think it actually causes some problems. So I'm interested to hear those discussions. What I think is more important than all this, though, is we need digital navigators out there that are working with people that can communicate with from an equity standpoint, some of our communities that are having a hard time getting connected up. And the same way that I support community health workers, they're of the community, going out to the community. One school district, and then I'll stop, but one school district gave hotspots out to every single student. 94% of them were not activated because those students and those families did not know how to use them. So that's the digital divide we're talking about. So as important is to reach some of the hardest areas. And I also think it's important when we talk about broadband equity, we talk a lot about rural. We know right here in the 3rd district, tons of people are struggling with reliable access to the internet. And that's been made blatantly obvious. And particularly our communities, our lower income communities and our communities of color are struggling with access and technology.
Yeah, and I'll just add, there was a shout out for Commerce Director Lisa Brown, our own 3rd District, Lisa Brown. And she, as the Director of Commerce, is very involved in broadband as well. The State Broadband Office is within the Department of Commerce, and there is a lot of activity going on there. And then also want to mention Council President Brian Beggs, because this is an area that he's talked about a lot. And local governments do have a lot of say in this. Certainly, there are some things at the state level we can do in terms of funding and some adjustments in state law to give more flexibility. But it's the cities often, or the local municipalities, that are granting the franchises for internet and cable, at least. And so there's a role to be played there. So I think this is a local, state, and federal partnership to work together on the funding and the policy.
I do want to mention, I know that Representative Gregerson is looking at what California did on the universal services tax to help provide some of this infrastructure, not necessarily on basic services, but for people who are maybe getting some of those packages that are or internet speeds that are higher, to add the same way we do with our phones, some sort of universal services tax. That whether or not that gets legs is left to see. But I love that all these proposals are coming forward. And thanks, Andy, for the shout out for Lisa. One quick story, because it's town hall related. When I was a staffer for Senator Brown, we sent postcards out and had an email response to those who were going to attend. And that's when I realized, when I've got tons of calls to say you did not have a phone number where we could RSVP, when I realized that this, is a problem in urban areas, particularly as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is another question from Joel. He has concerns regarding the Airway Heights Correctional Facility and wants to know your plan to address the following issues. There's 3 that he's concerned about. One is the out of control COVID cases at the correctional facility. 2 are inmate accusations that they were strong-armed into working when they were concerned about getting COVID. And then finally, the staff member who was fired for wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt when other staff were wearing Police Lives Matter shirts.
I can't speak to the last of the issues. I'm not aware of that, but spoke with some of the staff at Airway Heights. And I think part of this whole wildfire spread recently was a result of some complacency. There was infections at places like Stafford Creek and Coyote Ridge and other places. And Airway Heights was largely, this is going back months now, was largely unaffected. And I think a sense of complacency, like we were somehow immune from the laws of gravity over here, took hold among at leadership, staff, and at the level of the folks that are doing time there. And I think that then you introduce a little ignition source, and it just boomed to now a 70% population. And they have been really, really struggling. I asked specifically about the strong arming of individuals to perform tasks that had them concerned. I was assured, and this, I'm getting my information as much as you all are from media reports, and I did read the same thing. I think this is one of those investigations we have to get to the bottom of. I was told that that didn't happen, but this again requires unpacking. I was not familiar with the T-shirt issue. As far as that goes, when the legislature convenes, we can make some noise and we can express our displeasure. As far as policy level stuff and getting to, for example, the Department of Corrections Secretary's name is Sinclair, Secretary Sinclair. And you know, I have a outreach into Secretary Sinclair, and I think they're dealing with a lot of folks like me that have concerns and getting back to us. So that was just something that happened on Thursday. So I expect to have this conversation with him about what they're doing to mitigate this rural wildfire that's happening out in Airway Heights, and the legitimate concerns of the inmates out there as well as staff about their personal safety.
Thank you, Tim. Kantha asks a question about the NAACP, the local branch of the NAACP, and wonders whether it might be possible for more partnership to occur locally, perhaps with state agencies, perhaps with other organizations surrounding issues relating to equity and connecting communities. I know she did not mention it in her question, but I know that the NAACP in the last year has done some work with the Sheriff's Office towards collecting statistics. And I'm a member of the local branch of the NAACP, and I certainly would support more discussions locally about equity and connecting communities. What are your collective thoughts from the three of you regarding that issue?
Yeah, so I mean, I think informally that is happening. I know I have reached out to the president, or I guess now to Curtis Robinson, who's just become the first vice president. But I reached out to him a couple of times over the last few months, seeking input as we think about police accountability and other racial justice issues. And then we have at times done that in a more formal way as a state, as there are different state groups working on various issues. And as we need local representatives, or we want, you know, broad-based statewide representation, we go to organizations like the NAACP and say, hey, do you have somebody who could be on this state board or this state task force to help inform that? I would be interested in any other specific ideas. For instance, maybe a town hall specifically with NAACP members, or really any other idea. So, I mean, we're in the mode of listening, and then taking what we hear and try to put that into action in terms of the budget and in terms of legislation. And so it is a central part of our job to have those conversations and to listen. And I welcome every opportunity to do that. So I just encourage people to reach out with their specific ideas. Our email addresses, and maybe Joanne can put them up on the board, but they're easy to find. It's our first name dot last name at leg.wa.gov. It's also just easy to do an internet search for our email addresses. And I read every email that comes in, and we respond to every email from a constituent. And so send your ideas and your requests along, please.
I would just add that I think this idea, particularly connecting when there's statewide conversations, it just enhances the policy to make sure that we have folks from all corners of our state, and from my perspective, east of the Cascades. Just this last week, Rep. Johnson from Federal Way, who's one of our leaders on our policing policy leadership group, met with Spokane County Against Racism. I work to set that meeting up. I love those opportunities. If I can help connect particular members that are working on those issues, or just ourselves, I'm sure Andy and Tim and I would love those opportunities. But we can also be conduits. And even speaking of Curtis Robinson, there was a statewide task force, and I know the House worked, and I worked with him to get him appointed. It didn't quite work out because there were some travel things, but those types of opportunities. But it's incumbent upon us too to make sure that those opportunities are being widely broadcast too. And I think I'll commit to doing try and do even a better job to make sure those opportunities come up. But I like the idea of, just a format like this with members would be fantastic from my standpoint.
And if I can kick in real quick, and I'm experiencing some connectivity issues here myself, so you'll forgive me as I try and get that sorted out. But from a practical application standpoint, one of the issues that came out statewide was the distribution of economic relief for disadvantaged business enterprises, for relief from loans and grants that were available for those well-connected, much like the Paycheck Protection Program at the federal level. Real concerted effort on the part of the governor's office, as well as the Department of Commerce. And again, we have the benefit of having Lisa Brown as the director at Commerce to really focus economic resources to those folks that would otherwise be challenged or think it wasn't available to them. And that has been a real concerted effort on the business side, on the economic recovery. That was a direct result of input and, frankly, frustration and disappointment on the part of many about not having those economic resources available. And I think that spins off into many of the other issues in this whole ecosystem of equity.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. The next question is another question from Larry, and he wants to know what are the prospects for the governor's Climate Commitment Act?
All right. So can you just say that again? The governor's climate commitment? What was the last word you said?
Yeah, the Climate Commitment Act.
Act. Okay. I'm not familiar with what the specific Climate Commitment Act is, but if I think it's the cap and invest proposal. If that's right, I can talk about that a little bit. So the governor's kind of starts the legislative process by rolling out his budget, but also sort of associated policies. And one of the things that he's put out is a proposal that has a strong, and he's been such a leader on climate action, that includes a package that includes clean fuel standards and also a cap and invest proposal. And I think there's a number of legislative leaders, including Senator Carlisle and Representative Fitzgibbon, who are working on this as well. Senator Loveland and Saldana also involved in this policy area. And I think it will be a major topic for discussion. And as I mentioned earlier with the clean fuel standard, I think the key to passing this is going to be to have this package of a transportation and infrastructure package along with climate policy. It's possible it could pass on its own, but what we're trying to do is to package it up together because it is so intertwined, and to pass it as a package. So that's the effort. That's, I think, the governor's vision as well. And in terms of the chances of it passing, I don't think I could hazard a guess, but I can, in terms of the chances that we're going to work hard and try to pass it, I'd say that's 100%.
And I don't hear anyone else chiming in. So we currently have 4 questioners in the queue. You'll note that I say questioners because when we get to the first one, it's 3 separate questions will be coming at you. So if you have a question, go ahead, Mark.
I would say, since you said not here and chime in, I would just say, another good lesson I learned from my former boss, Lisa Brown, when she was majority leader I was working for, is that, it's hard to prognosticate, and it's what 50 House members, 25 senators can agree upon, and the governor, hopefully. So it's really hard to look in that crystal ball and understand. But as Tim said, from the House priority perspective, climate is Andy said, we're going to be really shrunk down what we're looking at, but also provides focus, and that again falls into one of our 4 buckets of focus this year.
Thank you, Marcus. Our next 3 questions come from Lars. Lars, the first question from Lars is directed to Senator Billig. When Senator Billig mentioned that we should expect less legislation this session, where should we lower or manage our expectations for this session?
We don't know. I mean, it's going to be, we're blazing new ground here, and it's never been done in this format. So I think it's, that's just a statement about sort of general volume. I would say that more complicated bills are going to be harder to pass, especially if they're new. It usually takes a year or 2 or more for a complicated issue to sort of get acclimated, and for legislators and staff to really understand it and get into the details. And I just think that's going to be even more the case. When I think about the amount of work that happens in the legislature of moving things along in the format of short, sort of on-the-go conversations, that there's so much of that. There's so much of I'm walking into a committee meeting or at a committee meeting, and I see a fellow senator that I don't see very often, and I say, oh, by the way, how are you on that issue? Okay, did you consider this? Did you consider that? And it might be a 1-minute conversation that never would have happened if we had to schedule a meeting. But it does happen as we pass each other in the hallway, or as we have a chance to kind of chat while we're waiting for the next bill to come up on the floor, or in a caucus meeting, or conversations that we might have with the different advocates who are around Olympia on issues. All of that sort of pushing and prodding and massaging that happens in those casual conversations is now going to either be lost or have to happen in text or email or phone calls, which is going to be much more cumbersome. So I can't predict exactly what is going to fall by the wayside, but I think bigger, more complicated things are going to be harder. We've asked our members, and I think the House has done the same, to just, in anticipation of fewer bills, less capacity to introduce fewer bills, and our chairs are going to schedule fewer bills for hearing. So some of the things that are not going to happen may not be things that you ever see, that it's not like they get introduced and then can't pass. It just may be things that some member would have introduced, but they just sort of put aside and hold off for next year. We've really asked people to focus on things that are time sensitive, that are related to recovery, or just urgent time sensitive issues. And I consider climate action, I consider racial justice, both to be time sensitive, as well as certainly all of our economic and health recovery issues that we're working on.
And question number 2 from Lars. Given that the Spokane Regional Health District discontinued the walking school bus program due to some lost state funding, is that something that the legislature might want to either reauthorize or refund so that the health district could take advantage of that?
Yeah, I wasn't aware that there was some reduction in funding but I'd be glad to look into that.
Yeah. Okay, and I'll provide Lars with your email address. Andy, Marcus, or Tim?
I think that's something that sometimes things inadvertently get cut or you don't know the backstory, and that's where we can go to work and find out. I also think at the potential of a revenue package in transportation, we'll be looking at multimodal, looking at green belts and ways we can connect people. And Andy introduced a bill many years ago, and I introduced a bill. And while it's kind of cumbersome, I think the concept's being embraced more, and that is health as a transportation goal. And so I align with it, and I think we can kind of track down and see what happened there. And so I'll let feel free to CC me, and Andy and I and Tim, we can all. I was not aware, so that this is helpful. That's why these things are helpful.
David, I'd like to go back to the first question. And Andy, as usual, did a great job on the backstory. I have the benefit of the only thing that we actually have to do in a session is pass a budget. So that is a constitutional requirement. So if you come up with that definitely has to happen. That will happen. And that will be my primary focus. If you have a great shorthand, Lars, in your experience about discerning what we should be focused on, that's great. Andy mentioned there could be a 50% reduction in activity. It could be as much as 2/3 or 75% even, right? We don't know, because as Andy said, many of the things that you can check off as, oh, I talked to Nicole, she's fine with us doing this particular thing, instead of intentionally texting Nicole, who's busy with her family maybe at the time, or busy in a committee meeting. Having to be intentional instead of serendipitous in these interactions is really going to cut down. We have created a phone tree among the 5 members of our budget team: the House Majority Leader, the 3 vice chairs, Steve Berquist, Mia Gregerson, and Nicole Macri, and myself. And I can't tell you how much of a challenge that has been when we're not in session with all of those time pressures, to be able to get connected, share information, and get on the same page. So the one thing that I continue to be worried about is fair, firm, and consistent in the application of access to the legislative process. If we have 700 people want to testify on the budget bill, I can assure you that is not going to happen. We're not going to hear from 700 people. So how do we fairly and equitably give people voice to their concerns and have it inform the legislative process? That is uncertain. I love the equity of, well, we've been speaking about digital equity, and not everyone has great access, but folks in Eastern Washington and in more far-flung places from Olympia will be able to have the same ability as someone just down the street from the Capitol. But how do we determine how to best get those voices included in testimony in committee and meet with constituents as well? I'm extremely concerned about that. Don't know how we're going to do that.
Yeah, I need to share too. A lot of what we do is about the relationships we build with the community, with our colleagues. And honestly, one of the biggest concerns I have, just looking out for the legislature as a whole, we have a very diverse, awesome new class of freshman legislators coming in, and they're going to be at a real deficit. It's a new world. They might not know what they're missing, but just the ability to work with folks. For me, from a constituent side, to be in a room with somebody and hear that story firsthand is powerful. Zoom is great. Video is great, but it's just not the same. And then just what Andy said, bouncing around off the walls of the Capitol, running into people where you run into them and they're like, let's solve that problem now. Let's work on that now. And you just go off into a room and you work on it. And that's going to be hard.
I can just say from my previous experience, when I had 12 or 17 free minutes, I would leave my office and start walking around, because I would invariably run into somebody that I needed to talk to. And that was just my intentional, I had no plan. I didn't know who I was going to run into or what issue was going to be discussed, but that was a good use of my time, always a good use of my time. And now I have to sit down and think about the 17 people that I would like to contact intentionally that I may have run into serendipitously in previous circumstances. And that, what I'm really going to miss is caucus. And that is when we all sit in our classroom, so to speak, where we're among our Democratic colleagues, whether in the House or the Senate, that it really creates a family environment that is really integral in us getting on the same page, being able to look in the eye of our other colleagues, see what's on their mind. Like I can see Marcus and Andy and Nicole and David and a picture of Joanne, but everybody else that's on this call, I can't see. I don't know, body language. I don't know. It's just going to be a lot more difficult.
Thanks. And the final question from Lars is a general question, and he'd like each of you to comment briefly. How do you each evaluate the balance between legislating statewide standards and allowing cities or counties the ability to set their own policies and practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so my default is that we should let local municipalities decide how to do things. Like that's where I start, because I just think, locally elected leaders, so they're accountable to their local voters, have the best pulse on their communities. And then also, we're a diverse state with different, needs in different places. So I like that flexibility. However, there are times where consistency matters, where it would be difficult to have a different rule in a certain way in every different city throughout the state. And then I think there are other things where there just may be something that is so basic, a basic service or right that shouldn't be negotiable, and that it's appropriate for your elected state legislators to say, this is sort of a minimum for our state, and we want everybody to be able to do this. And I think, even when you look at something like the Growth Management Act, which is a really complicated policy for which development happens, but that was mostly an opt-in. So even that, which now a lot of local municipalities complain about, even that was mostly an opt-in, which I think is good. And then, the state said, if you're going to opt into this, here are the rules. So I like that as a model, that we try to give opportunities for locals to have flexibility, but there are some things that just shouldn't be negotiated, piecemeal.
And if I can add, we really do want to start out with a focus of fair, firm, and consistent in the application of standards, as you outlined in your question, Lars. But I'll have to be honest. My first thought is I go to the partisan implications on this. Was it something the city did? Do I trust them? Yeah, I think that's okay. Was it something the county did? Is that less? Then I have to remind myself about the fair, firm, and consistent component of this. And it really is a challenge. So your question is very enlightened in this challenge. I will say one example that I'm familiar with happened on the Charter Schools Initiative. It was a problem very specific to the Seattle School District, where individuals, for very good reasons, which I believe they could have accomplished what they wanted under current law, but weren't getting cooperation with the Seattle Public School Board, and then went to a statewide effort to kind of create that system statewide for all of us. And that was from the inability or failure, I don't know what the circumstances were, of them addressing those issues very specific to that one locality. Then we got a statewide solution that was much less elegant, as far as I was concerned, to apply everywhere. But it does happen, and we need to be sensitive, as Andy pointed out, of all the moving parts and the implications of a statewide decision.
Yeah, and I'm sensitive. I like everything that I've heard so far, but I would say, there's instances where, we represent within, like, say, the county, the 3rd district is X number of constituents. And when you got to make sure that people's voices are heard, that they're being represented. Sometimes we outgrow systems like at the county commission, where I think that having 3 county commissioners for 500,000 people is not necessarily maybe bringing representation closer to the people. Things like, that get brought to us, like adding a tribal member to the Spokane Regional Transportation Council. Well, that seems to me like common sense as a partner, but when that's not getting done, then we have to weigh in. I'll be introducing a bill on the emergency communications tax in Spokane. Right now, it's a bill that simply says that you have to agree or you have to have an interlocal agreement between the county and the largest city. If that city's over 500,000 population, for our community, that's about a little over it's about $12 million a year. Right now, the county takes all that money. We have 2 separate dispatch systems. I want to see those folks all play in the same sandbox so that public safety is put first. So we need these things pop up. I think the other thing too is sometimes the local movement really pushes the state movement, like it tips, and we can see if something passed in the city of Spokane actually is a bellwether to something that should be passed throughout the state. And people say if they can do that in Spokane, then this should be statewide. Just largely sometimes some of our differing political challenges out here. So it goes back and
identify Marcus as our go-to discerner of the local state things. Been very successful, whether it was the county commission business, working on the health board. Specifically, one of our biggest challenges in the state, throughout the state, is the independently elected governing boards of the school districts. There is a local control issue there that 295 individual democratically elected school boards govern the policy at school districts, and the state provides the funding for basic education. And those things are in tension, right? Local decision-making, central state funding. And that is an issue. I don't have a better system. I can't think of a better system, but it's always in tension.
I don't want to miss this opportunity to say that if things get out of balance, if one person controls so much at one level of government that they are doing things like, unfortunately, sending CARES dollars maybe in directions they don't need to be, if they're doing things like blocking inclusion on our boards, then I think then we need to do our part too. I think that's unfortunate. One person shouldn't wield so much power, and you can probably fill in the blanks of who I'm speaking of.
Thank you. This question is actually somewhat related. It's from Roz and Norm. And first, they wanted to thank you, Marcus, for your plans to address the composition of public health boards. And I assume this question is directed primarily to you, but others are welcome to chime in should you have input. But they ask, besides Spokane and the problems we have seen, is the same thing true throughout the state on other county health boards?
Yes, there was a pretty intense thing going on in Pierce County as well. We've seen in other areas where health officers, public health people have either resigned, been fired, etc. So this is a statewide issue. I think that's what the governor's trying to get at with a more broad policy. My bill that I'm looking to put forward works within the existing structure, but just tries to bring balance back to the boards. The bill that I'm prime sponsoring, that is governor request language, is a much broader look, and also at how we restructure our health boards and maybe look to regionalize them, and also look at how we connect a funding source, particularly because, bottom line, not a Republican, not a Democratic issue. We have underfunded foundational public health, and the COVID pandemic has unfortunately shown the wide gap in it. And I don't think it was intentional to hurt our communities, but we got to remember that it's the first line of defense. So how those boards operate and the structure and who makes up those boards is extremely important. But really, the funding of foundational public health is the top goal, I think, that we could come out of with this session, in a very difficult session. So we need to look at things like revenue.
And can I say, very good question, because many folks' experience with their health districts is not our experience. And when I explain what Marcus is working on and why, they're like, oh, well, that's really not a problem here. So again, that is one of those exchanges of information that is going to be a little bit more challenging in this virtual environment than what we've been used to over the years that we had in-person meetings. The ability to explain the seriousness of this issue as it relates to us, and for us to hear from other areas, because our experiences based on where we live, hear from other people about maybe not necessarily public health, but other challenges their particular community is experiencing that we're not, and putting that all in the stew of state policy and budgets.
The next question comes from Gavin, who is focusing on the electrification of our transportation infrastructure. How can the state help incentivize the installation of electric vehicle charger into garages and driveways so that their vehicles are fueled up overnight? And then as a follow-up, how do we make sure that this increase in demand for electricity does not come from dirty fuel sources?
Yeah, you know, one of the
Marcus,
things. Oh, good.
I'm sorry, Andy, as in the interest of assigning folks that have been working on it, Andy, you certainly have, but please go ahead. Sorry, I was just gonna make a smart aleck comment and put the pinch on Marcus.
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say again, commerce is really leading the charge on so many things, including electrification of the public transportation grid, which Marcus will know quite a bit about. Your question was specific about in the private side of things. I don't have any answers for that, but we need to tackle the public electrification issue initially. That's my very humble opinion.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is, you know, just the last part of the question about how do we ensure it's clean energy. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think in Washington, we have very clean energy. Hydro is extremely clean, and we've got wind and solar, and only a small portion of our electricity comes from fossil fuels, really. And so to use an electric car in Washington state is one of the cleanest places to do it. So it makes even more sense. When you use an electric car in Wyoming, it's actually not that clean, and it may not even be cleaner than a fossil, you know, than a regular gas car, because the electricity, some large portion of electricity comes from coal generation, but that's the opposite in Washington state. I haven't really seen proposals about helping specifically with home charging, but I think to the extent that we can make electric cars less expensive, just helps overall. And so we've had a system of credits for electric cars if they're $40,000 and under. So we're not talking about the really expensive Teslas. I don't think the state should be subsidizing those, but to try to make those cars that are, just because they're not in enough production right now, so they're still a little bit more expensive, to try to decrease the cost between a conventional car and an electric car. There are some incentives, and then hopefully that helps a homeowner to save a little bit so they can afford I think it's a few $100s to put in a home charging station.
Great. This next question is from Sarah, and she wants to know your vision for Eastern Washington 5 years from now, and what do you hope aspirationally comes to fruition?
I'll take a stab at that. You know, as a homegrown boy here, seeing the evolution of our community, the good, the bad, the indifferent, the ugly, I hope that looking forward 5 years, and I'm going to talk about this from the county level initially, I hope that the general attitude of folks in Spokane County is not such that we would have majority support for a Donald Trump ticket, for example, which we did in the last election, or 55% Spokane County vote for Lauren Culp for governor. And I think that a lot of that has to do not necessarily with focusing on the issues, but the general attitude of people feeling neglected, left out, disenfranchised, which my vision is that folks do not have that sense of being excluded from the process, being the tensions and pressures in their life being ignored. And the best way to communicate government's role in trying to ease that anxiety and that pressure, and that is constantly a goal I think we're all working on. But your question is super timely in that is something we always need to keep in our mind, is how can we make the business of government relevant to real people's real life challenges, and communicating that in a fashion that doesn't disparage this idea of collectively solving our problems as we do in government.
Go ahead, Marcus.
I mean, I probably think broader terms from an aspirational standpoint, like, and Tim mentioned and alluded to everything from that influenced me with my Jesuit education, but that bottom pillar of Maslow's hierarchy needs, that in Eastern Washington, people are not going, without, when we're talking about access to food, healthcare, education, housing, that we are checking the box and have moved significantly forward for all people. And that includes making sure that people have access to workforce training and, living wage jobs. And so really aspirationally though, if we can just start by checking off housing, food, healthcare. And when I say healthcare too, I always got to mention not just oral health as well, because that's something I'm passionate about, but and also what behavioral health and substance abuse treatment, like making sure when I say healthcare, it's not just I go to a doctor when I'm sick, like sneeze sick, it's like for the whole person. And so those are the ones that we need to significantly move forward. To think that we have twice the need for food right now. I mean, we are in a pandemic, but that we can't just get people the basics in a time of crisis is really troubling. And I think it's exacerbated in Eastern Washington, where people are things aren't as easily. We have distance in between place, we have a Second Harvest right in the heart of the third district, but all of our communities deserve access to food and healthcare and then and to be able to thrive in housing. So I know it's way out there, but if we're not making steps forward, I'm not sure what we're all doing as a society. And I certainly don't know what I'm doing as a legislator if we haven't moved that ball forward.
Great. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I love this question. And this may end up being the last question. So if it is the last question or one of the last questions, it's a great one to end on. What motivated me to run and what motivates me to continue to serve is seeing the need and the opportunity in Spokane, and particularly in the 3rd legislative district. We are the lowest income legislative district in the entire state. So we're 49th out of 49 in median household income. I just got the updated rankings, and unfortunately we've held our spot in last place. And so what all of us do and is, I think, really focus on things that help break the cycle of poverty. And we're not going to completely break the cycle of poverty in 5 years, but we can set the stage to do that. And one of the things, so for my sort of aspirational view for 5 years, is focused on childcare and early learning, because it is the most effective way to break the cycle of poverty. So my aspiration would be that that every family, every child has access from 0 to 5, every child has access to high quality childcare and early learning in Spokane, either because they can afford it or because they have subsidies to be able to get access to a high quality program. And, it's the best, it's the number one intervention for reducing prison populations. It's the number one intervention for high school graduation. It's the number one intervention for increasing going to college and college persistence. It helps improve health outcomes. It also pays the best return for taxpayers with almost $10 back for every dollar we put in. So that's my aspiration.
Thank you, Senator. That does, in fact, conclude our questions. We have a couple additional ones that we'll pass along to each of you for potential follow-up on. I would like to thank Nicole Bishop, the chair of the Spokane County Democratic Party, for her assistance in being a co-moderator, and also would like to thank Joanne Fleming, state committee member from the 3rd Legislative District, who helped keep things running behind the scenes. I'd also like to thank all the folks out there who are either watching currently, submitted questions, may watch this program in the future. And then lastly, I'd like to thank the 3 legislators from the 3rd Legislative District who have given us an hour and a half of their time just before a busy remote session to talk to us and to get information from us and to provide their candid thoughts as to how this session, which will be a most unusual legislative session, will be moving forward over the near term. So thank you to State Representative Tim Ormsby, State Representative Marcus Riccelli, as well as Senator Andy Billig. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Happy New Year to all. And this concludes our virtual town hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.